Today we want to look at the Ten Commandments. We begin in Matthew chapter 22 and verse number 34, where the text says, "When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him." And we know that the Sadducees, Pharisees, scribes, and so forth were always attempting to test Jesus to ensnare him in his words. So the question that he asked is this, verse 36, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" So basically he wants to know, what is the greatest commandment? Verse 37 says, "When he said to him, that is Jesus, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment." Look at verse 39. "And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Wow. So Jesus says the greatest commandment is, first of all, to love the Lord, to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. It's basically saying with every fiber of your being, you should love God. But he said the second one is like it. That is, you should love your neighbor, that is your fellow man, your fellow woman, fellow humanity, if you will, as you love yourself. He says, on these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. In other words, everything can be wrapped up in these two laws. And as we're going to look at, as we dive into this lesson, the Ten Commandments, the first four laws that Moses or God speaks, we're going to see in Exodus chapter 20, have to do with our relationship with God. The last six have to do with our relationship with one another. And so he says, if you love God, guess what? You won't place another God before him. If you love God, you're not going to make for yourself any type of graven image. If you love God, you're not going to take God's name in vain. And if you love God, you're going to remember the Sabbath day as he has instructed them. That is, we're going to look at the context, would be referring to the Israelites. We're not bound by that today. And likewise, if you love God, if you love, that is, your fellow man, you're not going to commit adultery with your neighbor's wife. You're not going to steal from your neighbor. You're not going to bear false witness against your neighbor. You're not going to do anything that causes your neighbor or takes away from your neighbor or does something that sins against your neighbor. And so that's why he says, as we're going to look at, if you do these two things, then guess what? Everything really is hinged on these two things. Because if you love God, you're going to keep his commandments. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to do anything to sin against him. So we begin in Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments. And it's actually the 10 words, but we typically call the 10 Commandments or the 10 Commandments. But nevertheless, what we have here is God is going to be the one doing the speaking here. He's going to speak from heaven. And that's unheard of. Obviously, it's unheard of from the vantage point that there's only one God, and we can't even imagine any other nation having a God that speaks to them in that manner, because there is but one God. But nevertheless, God speaks to them. That is, he speaks to a group of people from heaven. It's not like he spoke to Adam. It's not like he spoke to Noah. It's not like he spoke to Moses. He speaks to not just individuals. He's speaking to an entire nation, an entire group of people from heaven. And he's going to give them and make a covenant with them. This covenant is going to be for them. Now, obviously, we're going to notice that we're not bound by the things that we're about to dive into. But we will see and notice that we still are bound by some of the laws that he mentioned here, even though the consequences for breaking those laws are not the same. But it's, again, very significant that God spoke to this group of people, this nation, indicating that, again, when he spoke to them not even while before they go to the land of Canaan. He speaks to them and is about to make a covenant with them to let them know that you're going to be my people and I will be your God. And it begins in verse number 2 by saying, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Notice, he says, "I am the Lord your God. I am the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Now, I would have you to know that Jewish individuals view this as the first commandment. But as for our lesson, we're going to look at it as I would term the traditional way, even though obviously Jewish people would not term that as the traditional way, but they view this as the first commandment. But it's significant here is, the significant thing here is that God tells them, okay, I am the God. I am the one who brought you out of the house of bondage, out of the house of slavery. I am your deliverer. All right? And so this is important. He reminds them and tells them, okay, this is who I am, and I'm going to make this covenant with you. The first commandment we have is you should have no other gods before me. God says, I will not come second to anyone. There are no other gods. I am the only true God. I am the God that delivered you out of the house of bondage. Understanding that these people have been enslaved and they have come from a nation that was ruled by a man who sat on the throne who believed that he himself was God. But every plague that God performed, every single plague was to show them that there is but one God. He did these plagues to show that he was the only true God and there was no God but him. And the penalty that he attached to individuals who went about to serve other gods was death. That's how serious it was. God says, I would not come second to anyone. Because how a person views God and how a person looks at God is going to shape the way that they think about the world. A person who does not believe in God is going to think differently about the world than someone who believes that there's only one God. And so beginning the foundational stone to a society has to be the belief that there is but one God. There is but one God. And in the Old Testament, the punishment for worshiping or having another God was death. The second law. In Exodus chapter 20, verse number 4, God says, you shall not make for yourselves a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, that is in the water under the earth. You should not bow down to serve, that is to worship them, for I, the Lord, am a jealous God. So notice what he says. First of all, he says, you should have no other God but me. Secondarily, he says, you should not carve for yourself any type of image to say that this is your God. Remember, no one has seen God at any time. God is in heaven. God is a spirit. So it was very common for individuals to make for themselves carving images to represent God. But God says, you cannot represent me in any type of fashion. I am the God who sits in heaven. So don't carve for yourself any type of graven image. I will not be represented by any type of carved or image. I am a God who sits high. Because what happens is when you carve for yourself and make for yourself a God to say that represents me, your image and your impression of God changes. So God says, do not make for yourself any type of carved image or any type of likeness. Because again, individuals serve the sun god. They serve the moon god. They serve a water god. They served all type of fertility god. There were so many different types of God, and God says there is but one God, and I am He. Everything that happens, I am the creator of all the world, and everything that exists is because of me. And he says, I am a jealous God. In other words, jealousy has to do with love. God loves us, and not only that, He will not share, that is, our affection should not be split between God and someone else. Anything that splits our attention between God and something else, God says that cannot happen. We have to make sure that we understand that God, as the first law says, you shall have no other God but me. No other God but me. Remember what when the Pharisee or the scribe came to Jesus and asked him, okay, what is the great commandment? Jesus said, okay, this is the greatest. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, body, and soul, with every fiber of your being. God is a jealous God, and He will not share your affection and love with anyone. Not your parents, not your spouse, not your child, nothing, no one. So God says, I am a jealous God. And notice what He says, visiting. That is, I'm punishing the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. What is He saying? God is not saying that He's going to punish someone because of the sins of their fathers. That God has already indicated, is going to indicate later that that's not what He does. We have in Ezekiel chapter 20, chapter 18, that God does not punish the father with the sons. The son is not going to bear the iniquity of the father is not going to bear the iniquity of the son. But what we do have here is this. We have to realize that what happens is when a person is often to sin, that is, a person in this context worshiping something other than God, there's a big chance that their children also is going to worship the same thing that their parents worship. All right. So a lot of times, whatever a person is that is religiously, guess what? Their children are going to be the exact same thing. So if you have a person who is worshiping a false god, there's a high probability that that child is going to grow up and worship the same thing that his parents worship. So God says He's going to punish them, not for the sins of their fathers, but because they are still continuing in the sin of their father and of their parents. All right? So that's why it's important for individuals to have a clear understanding, a clear foundation in regards to who the one true God is. Think about this. Why is it important for parents to instill a right understanding of who God is and why His word, that is the Bible, is so important to his and her children? Why? Because without that clear foundation, kids will wander off and think that, okay, it really doesn't matter how I feel about God. It doesn't matter how I worship God. It is important for parents, first of all, to search out and find out what is the truth in regards to worshiping and serving God, because it has eternal consequences attached to it. The way that you answer that particular question in regards to who God is going to affect not only you, but also your posterity. That is your children and their children, because you're going to instill something possibly that is false to your children. They're going to teach their children, they're going to teach their children. And all this is predicated on the false teaching that you instilled in your children. But God says, I'm a jealous God, and I will not come second to anyone, and I will punish all those. Again, anyone who worships God and makes for himself, in this context, any type of graven image. And guess what the penalty was? The penalty was death. Anyone who worshiped and made for themselves any type of graven image, the penalty was death. And again, we have in the New Testament, in the letter of 1 John, the very last verse, John tells them that they need to avoid idols. But the penalty in the Old Testament, under the Old Testament, to the Jewish people, to the Israelites, was death. The penalty was death, because you are bringing in a false religion, a false God for the people to worship, and you're turning away their affection and mind away from God. Now that's important, again, to understand that God will not share our attention, our affection, our devotion with anyone. You cannot serve both God and money, God and anything. God says, I must have it all. But then he says, the last verse, verse number 6, he says, but showing mercy. Notice he says, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. So notice the contrast. For those who worship falsely, he says, guess what? Those that hate me, they're going to be punished. But those that love me, guess what? I'm going to show mercy to them. Why? Because they love me and they keep my commandments. Notice the connection between love and commandments. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. They go together. You can't have love. That's why Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. They go together. And again, the punishment for breaking this law was death. And it's funny that Jeremiah jokes with the Jewish people, the Israelites, when he tells them, okay, why is it that you make for yourselves? You go out into the woods, and you carve for yourself an image, and you shape it, and you dress it up, and you bow down and you worship, you carry it everywhere, and it's a God that you made. It's a God that you made yourself. And so he says it's really silly that individuals would do that. The psalmist says you have these gods that have eyes that cannot see, they have ears that cannot hear. Right? There's only one God, and God says you cannot fashion me in your own image. And see, God has made us in His image. We're spirit beings. But what we want to do, we want to fashion God into our image and make Him down and bring Him down to our level. But God says that is not the way it should be. And the punishment for that was death. The third commandment is, you should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So notice what he says. You should not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And typically we talk about not using God's name carelessly, not attaching God's name to any type of swear words and so forth, and not using his name again carelessly and just saying things without actually wanting or petitioning God. And I believe that is true. But the idea here is also, when you look at the word take, I think the original has the idea of carry. Do not carry God's name in vain. So think about this. When you're thinking about you being a child of God, all right, that is the Israelites here being children of God. They were children of Israel. And so wherever they went, they were to carry God's name. And a lot of times when individuals do things, they do things in the name of God. So imagine you going out doing something in the name of God, but instead of doing good, you're doing evil. So what happens? When you do something evil in the name of God, guess what happens? You cause the name of God to be blasphemed. You cause God's name to be counted as nothing upon in the midst of heathen individuals, in the midst of individuals who do not serve God. And you cause God's name to be blasphemed. That's why he says the latter part, the Lord will not hold him guiltless, the one who takes his name in vain, the one who carries his name in vain. So being, and the punishment for this in Leviticus 24 was death. If anyone swore by God's name falsely, that person was to be put to death. Whenever God's name was taken in vain, that person was to be put to death. So all those things, all those ideas carry and show us that we should respect God and respect God's name. God's name should not be used as a swear word. God's name should be glorified, and we should respect him for who he is and not put him on our level, because he's high above us. He's our creator, right? And so we should respect him, and we should not just carelessly use God's name. God is a awesome God, but he should be feared. And when I say fear, I'm not just saying being reverent. We should be reverent toward him as well, but he also is a God to be feared. And so here we find that the punishment for breaking this particular law was death. And you see a trend here. The punishment for having another God but him is death. The punishment for making for yourself a carved image was death. The punishment for taking God's name in vain was death. And again, for those individuals who attempt to say that we're still under the Ten Commandments, again, if we're still under the Ten Commandments, that would mean that the punishment that is enumerated in Scripture that is in the Old Testament will still be binding as well. And the punishment for the ones we looked at so far is death. And now we'll come to the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment says this in verse number 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, the Sabbath day obviously has to do with a time period of rest. And he says you need to sanctify it. You need to set it apart. And that's what the word holy means, to be set apart. Remember when Jesus, or rather when God created the world in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the text tells us that he created the world in 6 days. And that's what we're going to look at the latter parts of these verses. But on the seventh day, he rested. He sanctified the seventh day. It doesn't mean that he was tired, but he had completed his work. And verse number 6 says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to work 6 days, but the idea here is there's a time for work, and as we're going to see, there's a time for rest. All right. So he says 6 days you ought to labor and do all your work. But on the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. So he says 6 days you can work, but you need a time period of rest. You need a time period to be a Sabbath of the Lord your God. Notice what he says. In it you should do no work. And obviously individuals, especially Israelites, Jewish individuals, would ask the question, okay, what constitutes work? But here, realizing that they lived in an agricultural setting, if you will, those things that were attached to their work, they were not to do any type of labor. And then notice what he says. In it, you should do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. Wow. Now, again, this is unheard of. Because, again, individuals were attached to their job in somewhat similar how it is even today. Individuals are known by what they do. All right. So even today, when you ask someone, for one of the first things when you meet someone, you may ask them, what do they do? What is your profession? What is your occupation? Because we attach so much to individual's job, which again, is nothing wrong with that. But the idea here is there's a time to work, but also there's a time to rest. And the idea here is not just resting, but also making this a holy day to God. And so he says, not only were you not to do any type of work, your son was not to do any type of work. In other words, you're not going to be resting while you send your son out or your daughter out. Not only that, he says, nor your servants, that is your slaves, your male servants or your female servants. Now, again, that was totally unheard of, especially in a society where slaves and people just in general, especially slaves, worked year round. I mean, you could work for years, tens of decades without getting a day off, because again, society was built around working, built around the idea you had to work. And so God says everyone has to rest. Not only you or your son or your daughter, but your male servants and your female servants, and also your animals were to rest. Not only that, the strangers, all right, the foreigners, the aliens who sojourned with you, everyone was to rest on this particular day. And again, we're talking about a society where individuals, you're talking about resting one day out of a week throughout the entire year, when individuals will work years and years and years without resting one day. All right, again, very unheard of. And so what we have here, God gives a reasoning here. He says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. That is, he made it holy. He sanctified it. So he says the reason behind it, this reason he gives, is because 6 days God created the heavens and earth. And again, this points to, again, a different lesson, is the idea that God created the world in 6 literal days. That is 24-hour time period. And on the seventh day, he rested. All right. And so here we have that God did this in 6 days. He says, I worked on 6 days. You can work on 6 days, but on that seventh day, you are to rest. And notice what the punishment was. The punishment for breaking this particular law was death. You couldn't pick up sticks. You couldn't do, and in Numbers chapter 15, the occasion where a man is found picking up sticks, and it was not very clear to Moses what should be done to him. And God says he should be killed. Again, placing and showing the great emphasis on breaking God's law and holding to what God has said. God says, I want you to not do any type of work. I want you to place your confidence in me. And so what we have here is God says that the penalty for breaking this particular commandment is death. Now, under the New Testament, we're not bound by this. The Bible tells us that let no one hold you into keeping the Sabbath. Now, we can also keep in mind that the Sabbath was not replaced by Sunday. All right, that idea is not found in Scripture neither. In fact, when individuals became Christians, that is, Jewish individuals became Christians, a lot of them still held fast to kept the Sabbath. But nevertheless, they still worship God on Sunday. One did not replace the other. There are two different things. One was a time of gathering on the first day of the week, and the other one was a day of rest. But nevertheless, the penalty for breaking this particular law was death. And we could glean something from this. Individuals work and attach their entire life to working. They work all day, year round, right? And it's all about, and it's not in a lot of cases about making enough to survive, making enough to provide for his family, his or her family. It's about just making and getting to purchase and buy stuff. I got to keep working because I want to get this. I want to keep working because I got to get this. I got to get this. It's not about being able to have the daily needs and just getting a list of. It's about just accumulating wealth. And God says there has to be a time where you set aside not just working, but also a time of reprieve as well. I want you to think about this. In Exodus chapter 23, in verse number 12, the text says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Notice it says, 6 days you can do your work, but on the seventh day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. So notice what he says. There has to be a time when individuals are able to rest. Individuals have to have the ability to rest. Not only you, but also your animals. You're working your animals down. All right. So everybody, God cares about everyone and everything. Now, God does not place animals on the same level as humans, but he does, as his creation, realize that they need rest as well. All right. So that everyone can be refreshed. All right. In verse number, chapter 34 of Exodus, verse 21 says, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. In plowing time and harvest you shall rest. He says, even when it's time to plow, you should rest. Because a lot of times it's very easy for individuals to say, you know what, I got to do it now. If I don't do it now, it's not going to get it. God says there has to be a time when you rest. Now, again, a different lesson when you look at Leviticus chapter 25 with the year of Jubilee. Well, God says, not only are you to rest every seventh day, but also you are to rest every seventh year. That is, the entire year, do no work. Then, on the 50th year, you would do no work as well. So, imagine this. Every seventh day, you do no work. But then, every seventh year, that is, you work 6 years, All right. Then the 7th year, you do no work whatsoever. And then when you get to the 49th year, obviously you're doing no work. But then the 50th year, you do no work. Now, we don't have any record where they actually did this, because this takes faith in God that God is going to provide for you. The same thing how when you look at in Exodus chapter 16, and when God first instituted and gave them manna, and they looked at it and said, what is this? That's what manna means. But they did not have faith that God was going to provide for them. He gave them double on Friday so that they would not have to come out and work on Saturday. But nevertheless, individuals got more than they needed because their faith in God was not there. So it takes faith to realize that God cares about you. He is the one who built our bodies. He's the one who built our minds and created us and formed us. He knows everything about us. So God knows what we need. And he realizes and he says that working is not where it is. All right. You were not designed to work endlessly, nonstop. There has to be a time of rest, refreshing, and reflection. All right. And he says and a lot of times you see people in these high-powered jobs, and they have these things going on, and they brag and say, I hadn't taken a vacation, I hadn't done this in many years, as if that's something, a badge or something. And the families have been neglected. They haven't been able to be with their families. Even when they do take the vacations, they're working, and even during the time period when they are working, they're not able to come home. They're not coming home on time. It's just constant work, constant work, constant work. By the time they're older, the children are grown, the children are gone. They have lost touch with everyone. And again, God says there has to be a time of reflection, a time of rest, and focus on God. All right. Life is not all about working. The 5th commandment is this: honor your father and your mother. Honor your father and your mother. And what's interesting, when he says it again, he says honor your mother and your father. Again, it's showing that both individuals are important to the family. So he says honor. Now, what does that mean? It somewhat doesn't tell us exactly what that means, but we know what it doesn't mean. In other words, or how you cannot honor your family, honor your mother and father. He will later tell of individuals and the punishment for cursing your mother and father, for striking your mother and father. And again, we live in a society even today where individuals fight their mothers and fathers. They beat them up. They talk back to them. They disrespect them. The idea here is you honor your father and mother, number one, by caring for them, especially the same way they cared for you when you were coming up. There's going to come a time where your mother and father may not be able to do the same thing that they were accustomed to doing when they were younger. So it may be a time where you need to sustain them and help them and give them the things that they stand in need of. For example, when you look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 with the case of widows, and Paul says that it's needful for individuals to take care of those of their own family. All right? You have to take care of those of your own family. The person who does not take care of his family is worse than an unbeliever. All right? And so it's important that you help your mother and father in that particular way. But not only that, it's the idea of also honoring them by making sure that you live a life that is honorable. In other words, do not do things that will cause dishonor to your mother and your father. So it's not, you can imagine, for example, when individuals have children and they do certain things, they do certain things that the parents think are good. They tell people about it. They say, okay, my child is doing it, my child is doing that, even as they get older, because there's honor attached to that. But you bring dishonor to your mother and your father when you live a reckless, careless life. Right? And no mother, no father, a father wants to tell the world, okay, look at my son. My son is out there living recklessly. He's doing this, he's doing that, she's doing this, she's doing that. You bring honor to your mother and father by living a life that glorifies and honors God. And again, as we have left from, first of all, making sure that we recognize that there's only one God, recognize that we're not to make for ourselves any type of graven image, recognize that we should not take God's name in vain, recognize that that they were to keep the Sabbath day. Now you're moved to the first thing he says is to honor your father and your mother. Because again, a society, when you think about honoring God, the next thing comes in honoring your mother and father, the ones that are on earth. All right, those who God has placed in society to make sure that he is glorified by their children. All right, and so it's important that the way that a child honors his mother and father is going to affect the rest of society. If a child dishonors his mother and father, guess what's going to happen when he goes into society? He's going to care nothing about the authority, that is police authority or whatever type of authority. He's not going to care anything about it. So the same thing when it comes to the parents. If a child honors and respects his parents, it's highly likely that he will also honor those individuals in society that has authority as well. But if he does not respect his mother and father, he's not going to respect those other individuals as well. And so society breaks down. That's why we say that the family is the basic foundation of society. As the family goes, so goes society, so goes the church, so goes everything. Because if there's a breakdown in the family, if children are not honoring their mother and their father, all right, there's going to be a breakdown. Now, also, parents have to make sure that they are also living a life that deserves to be honored. Now, obviously, children should honor their mother and father irregardless. All right, as long as they're telling them, as long as they're not telling them to do something that is wrong. But my point here is make sure that parents, we as parents, are doing and living a life that our children can emulate. Because what's going to happen is, again, if we're not serving and worshiping God the way that we are commanded by God to do, then guess what? Our children are going to look at us, and they're probably going to follow in our footsteps. In other words, they're not going to take God seriously. They're not going to follow God the way that he has prescribed in his word. And so we got to make sure that we're doing and setting a good example. But as children, it is our job, it is our duty to make sure that we honor, show our mothers and fathers respect for who they are in society and who they are in the home, even when we outside of the home. Because remember, he would have been speaking this not only to those young children, but also adult children as well. More than likely, he's speaking about adult children honoring their father and honoring their mother. And the penalty for disrespecting your parent was death. Again, notice that the penalty for this is death, because the society breaks down when children dishonor their mothers and their fathers. Whenever the home structure is the foundation is broken, guess what? Society is going to go in the way of the home. So it's important that children honor their father and their mother. And notice what he says, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. So contextually, he's talking about preparing them for when they go into the land of Canaan. All right, the land will be able to be sustained. This is the only commandment that he gives that has a promise attached to it, and it's again reemphasized in the New Testament. But he tells them, if you do this, guess what? If the parents teach the children, as he's going to tell them in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Okay, parents, teach your children. Teach them when you wake up. Teach them when you're walking around. Teach them everywhere. Teach them about me. Teach them what the difference between right and wrong. Teach them. If parents do that and children listen, you're going to have a good society. But if you don't, then guess what? You're going to have a society that is bent on doing evil. And he says what happens here when parents are disrespected by the children, the punishment should be death. The sixth commandment is you should not murder. All right. So here what we have, and again, some translations, probably beginning with the King James and probably others as well, has do not kill. And that translation has caused so much confusion in regards to what does it mean, all right, you should not kill, all right. And again, just like our vocabulary or our dictionary has two definitions or two words that mean two different words for kill and murder, Hebrew does too, all right. And the word there is for murder. If the word was kill, that means that all killing is wrong. Right? That whether you're talking about military killing, where you're talking about killing in self-defense, all killing would be wrong. And so the idea there, you should not kill. You have now pacifists who do not believe that any type of killing is approved by God. But again, what we have here is the idea is not kill, but murder. Keep in mind, God is the creator of all the world. He created every single person. God does not murder anyone. He may kill by virtue of the fact that he owns everyone. Every person belongs to God. He is the creator of every single person. All souls belong to him. Because of that, he can take life from someone who is still in the womb to someone who's 100 or 900 years of age. It doesn't matter. God is the creator of everyone. So God does not murder. He can take life or whatever, because he's the only one ultimately that can give life. All right. And so he does not murder. God does not murder, but God does and can take life. He can kill. The same thing as we've been looking at, the idea of capital punishment. All right. The punishment for all the things that we've looked at so far has been capital punishment. Again, killing. So he cannot say, okay, thou shalt not kill, and then later say that the punishment for this is killing. All right. So those two things obviously are not the same. All right. So the idea is the intentional taking of someone who is innocent life. All right. So capital punishment, even today. First of all, when you look at Genesis chapter 9, verse number 6, before that, remember when Cain killed Abel, God did not kill Cain. He actually was merciful to him. Even though he slew his brother, even though he murdered his brother, God allowed him to live and even protected him when he complained and said that his punishment was too great. And not only that, we find that when Noah and his family came out of the ark, God says that now whoever takes someone's life, by man, his life is to be taken. Why? Because man was made in the image of God. And so even that was under patriarchal law. Under Mosaic law, guess what? The same thing. If someone intentionally takes someone's life, guess what? Their life is to be taken. And even in the New Testament, in Romans chapter 13, in the context of when you back up to chapter 12, God says, do not avenge for yourselves. All right. Vengeance belongs to God. And the way he says God executes his vengeance is through the government. That's why he says in chapter 13, all right, that the government is an avenger to do good, and he's a servant. The government is a servant of God. All right. I mean, he bears not the sword in vain. And the sword meaning something that is used to execute individuals. But here contextually, he says, do not murder. Do not take someone's life. If you take someone's life, then guess what? Your life is to be taken as well. Why? Because you're made in the image of God. He even says if someone has an animal, and he knew that that animal was dangerous, guess what? The animal is to be punished, and also the person is to be punished. Right? So the punishment for taking someone's life is death. You cannot just carelessly take someone's life. And imagine if we lived in a society where individuals valued human life. We do not value human life here. Right? You have abortions where individuals are carelessly taking innocent children's lives. And that's what they are. They're children. You cannot murder and take someone's life, all right, and just because they're in the womb and think that it is okay. All right, God takes the shedding of innocent blood, and you cannot think of anyone's blood who's more innocent than a baby that's still in the womb. And God says that the punishment for taking innocent life is death. Death, because you are taking someone's life. The Bible tells us also in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse number 11, is that because justice is not meted out speedily, is not carried out speedily, all right, man goes about to, his heart is bent on doing that which is evil. All right. Why? Because if I do something, guess what's going to happen? Nothing. All right. I may go to jail. I may serve a little time. I can get an appeal. And now understand that we're not talking about cases where individuals may not have done it or so forth. Under the law, a person could only be, capital punishment could only be meted out if there were at least 2 witnesses. All right, there had to be at least 2 witnesses for capital punishment to be meted out. But the purpose of it was to mete out evil out of a society. All right, and so you have to value human life. Human life is important. All right. So thoughts to think about. In Leviticus chapter 19, verse number 16. The text says, you should not go around as a slanderer among your people. Then it says, you should not stand up against the life that is the blood of your neighbor. I am the Lord. Now, I like the Jewish interpretation of this particular passage. The idea of what I'm getting at is even self-defense. When you think about self-defense is not murder. All right, you may kill someone, but it's self-defense. And so even the idea of protecting someone else, your family. All right. So Jewish interpretation has this meaning: do not stand by while your neighbor's blood is being shed. All right. In other words, your obligation is to protect those that may be in harm's way. All right. And so self-defense, yes, you don't say when someone protects themselves or protects their family that they have murdered someone. You may say they killed someone, but that's not murder, right? Because murder is the intentional taking of someone that is innocent's life, and that's not what murder or killing is. That is self-defense, right? And so we need to keep that in mind, that God has not prohibited or said that individuals cannot kill, right? God says you should not murder. You should not take someone a life that is undeserving of taking of having their life taken. So we have capital punishment where someone's life can be taken. We have wars where individuals' lives can be taken. And we have self-defense and so forth. And so we got to make sure we place these things in the proper context. All right. Then we have the 7th commandment. Again, this one goes and points back to the idea of the home. All right. And so think about thou should not commit adultery. Thou should not commit adultery. That is, actually, in Jewish thought, the idea was adultery was attached to the woman. All right. The woman was the one, she was married to someone, and she goes and have sexual relations with someone outside of her husband. All right. Because in some people's mind, thoughts is the husband can have sexual relations with someone else that other than his spouse, and it was fine. But again, I believe that God says that adultery, all right, because he's going to indicate that if the male or the woman is found, that is by witnesses, both of them are to be put to death. Both of them are to be put to death. The penalty for adultery was death. Why? Because you are breaking up the fabric of society by going out and destroying the family. But think about what could happen here. Number one, you have betrayed the trust of your spouse. Not only that, if from this union, that is that sexual union, that sinful union that individuals partake in, you could have a child outside of wedlock. And again, you're going to have a society where individuals, that child's not going to have perhaps both mother and father, because you've committed adultery, and that child is going to be with someone that is not your spouse, right? And so what happens is society breaks down. Society breaks down. So not only when you think about, in this context, adultery, but when you think about premarital sex, when you think about extramarital sex, we're talking about here, we're talking about homosexuality, all these things break down society. All right, it's a breakdown of society, because what happens is the family structure is violated. The family structure cannot be sustained when you go outside of the family. And the text tells us in Exodus chapter 20 and the rest of the occurrences that the penalty for this is death. And we see a trend here that the penalty for this is death. But in the New Testament, we have in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse number 9, that individuals were guilty of that, but they repented of that. That is, they got out of those adulterous relationships. They stopped those adulterous relationships, and therefore they were added to the body of Christ. And so what we have here is the penalty for adultery was death. All right, and so because adultery breaks down, again, the family, breaks down the family dynamic, breaks down the family foundation, and a society cannot be sustained where adultery prevails and where adultery abides. The eighth commandment is you should not steal. You should not steal. All right. And in Jewish thought, the first thing that would have come to their mind is the idea of stealing another person. All right, man stealing, if you will, kidnapping someone and stealing them with the purpose of selling them into slavery. All right. And so when you look at this, there's no way for anyone to come to the idea that, okay, what happened, especially in this country, where individuals were stolen from Africa and different parts of the world, even though they were sold by some of their own, the idea of stealing someone from their country and selling them and bringing them, taking them somewhere to use them as slaves was against, in this context, against the law, against the law of God. And the punishment for that was death. The punishment for that was death. All right, and so individuals would take individuals, steal individuals, and they would sell them for the purpose of slavery, for purpose of enslaving them, and the punishment for that, he said, was death. And so man stealing in that context would be punishable. All right, would be punishable by death. But also you have the idea of just stealing in general, because it's somewhat open-ended, isn't it? I mean, obviously you can't steal people, but also steal people's property, taking that something that belongs to someone else. All right, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's their horse, if it's their oxen, whatever the thing is that person owns. All right, you cannot take it. And it says if you take it, then guess what? If you take it, you have to pay restitution. All right. And we live in a society, especially here, where they talk about restitution, but no restitution is given. Right? So individuals, if a person could not repay for what they have stolen, all right, then guess what? They would have to work it off until they pay whatever it is that they had to pay off, or whatever the amount was that they had stolen. Now, obviously, it was limited up to 6 years. After 6 years, they would become free on the 7th year. But nevertheless, they had to make restitution for what they had done. All right. So the penalty for stealing someone, that is a person, was death. The penalty for taking someone's property, all right, was restitution. All right. And so you have to make sure that the thing you have to understand is, okay, you could not go around taking something that belongs to someone else. Right? You have to be satisfied with what you have. Right? And so imagine the society breaks down when individuals begin taking that which belongs to someone else. And that's going to be huge when we get to the last, the 10th commandment. The 9th commandment was, you should not bear false witness against your neighbor. You should not bear false witness against your neighbor. Basically, you should not commit perjury. And the idea here is in a court of law, but also it expands to just in society in general. That is society lying to one another in general. You cannot, again, a society cannot be sustained where individuals lie to one another. And you have a problem when individuals are habitual liars. And this is a problem with a lot of people. You got not only people outside in the world, but you have preachers that just tell lies. You got elders that just tell lies, deacons that tell lies, members in the body of Christ that tell lies. And a society or organization cannot be sustained where individuals are not being truthful. Now, the context here is you have the idea of someone in court telling or testifying to something that they know to be untrue, something that they know is not true, and they're testifying saying that it is true. All right. And so what happens here, God says, for when a person does this, what's going to happen? Whatever they meant to do to someone else, that's what should happen to them. All right. And so we know that as Christians, we should not lie to one another. We should tell one another the truth. So we said truth hurts, but imagine you lying to someone and they find out that you have been lying to them. All right, that's going to hurt more. The truth heals. The truth sets you free. All right. So we had Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. Notice what it says: a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. So you could not have one witness. You had to have more than one witness. Only on the evidence, notice it says, only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. And what's interesting when you look at the Mishnah, you notice that they had to make sure that they agreed. All right, they had to make sure that their testimony agreed. And we have occasions where, remember when Jesus Christ was crucified, they brought 2 false witnesses. They brought false witnesses, and their testimony did not agree. In the case of Stephen, all right, they had false witnesses. All right, and so the text tells us this. He says, verse number 16, if a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in those days. Verse 18, the judges shall inquire diligently. All right. So it's not like you say your part and I say my part and that's it. No, they're going to inquire and make sure that what you're saying is true. And if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. Wow. Imagine if that occurred today in our society, where you have so many individuals calling the police on individuals saying they've done something wrong, done this, and they are falsely accusing individuals of things they know that they have not done. What if what would have happened to them actually happens to them, right? For falsely accusing them. And so he says what's going to happen is you're going to purge the evil from your midst. So again, God places a high value on making sure that individuals tell the truth. All right. That's why the Bible tells us that God is not a man that he should lie, nor the son of man that he should repent. Also, he tells us in Titus chapter 1, verse 2 that God cannot lie. God cannot lie. And God hates individuals who lie. All right. And so we got to keep in mind that God wants us to speak truthfully to one another. We have to make sure that when we're dealing with one another, that we're telling the truth. That's why he said, let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. In other words, when you speak to individuals, speak with purpose, speak realizing that when you speak, that your word is your bond. In other words, whenever you speak, individuals should be able to trust what it is that is coming from your mouth. You don't have to say, okay, I swear I swear this part, I swear. No, whenever you speak, individuals should know that what you're saying is the truth. And then verse number 20 says, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you. All right. Why? Because they understand that there is a consequence to my wrong action. And we live in a society where individuals do not realize that there are consequences to our actions. There are consequences, or there should be consequences to our actions. We live in a society where there are not consequences attached to our actions. We can live and do anything, and there are no consequences for what we do. Now, there's a place for mercy, but there has to be consequences for our actions when we seek to do wrong. And lastly, we come to the 10th commandment. You should not covet your neighbor's house. You should not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. And this is the only one you notice that there isn't a punishment for, because this is one that regulates the heart, that has a commandment for the heart, for the mind. Wow. God says you should not covet. That is, the idea of coveting is not the idea of saying, okay, you see something that your neighbor has and you say, you know what, I like that. I wouldn't mind having that. That's not what he's condemning here. He's condemning the idea of seeing something that your neighbor has with the idea of, I'm going to take it. I would want to take it away from him or her. Right? So he says you should not covet your neighbor's house. You should not say, okay, I like my neighbor's house. I'm going to see what I can do to take my neighbor's house. All right? I like my neighbor's wife. I'm going to see what I can do to take my neighbor's wife. I like my neighbor's servant, so I'm going to take my neighbor's servant. I like my neighbor's animal, so I'm going to take my neighbor's. I'm going to see what I can do to take my neighbor's animal. He says you should not desire, in that particular aspect, covet anything that it is your neighbor's. All right? Now, this right here goes to the heart of, all right, the heart of all the rest of the commandments, because it's dealing with the heart. Remember, even Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 and 28, where he says, you've heard you should not commit adultery. But I say to you, whoever looks at a woman, all right, and desires her, well, that is lustfully, all right, has already committed adultery with her in your heart. In other words, the thing that you are doing in your heart is going to lead to you committing adultery. So let's look at this. Let me give you two examples. The first example is the case of David. David saw a woman whom he knew was the wife of someone else. She was the wife of Uriah, the Hittite. Her name was Bathsheba. He coveted after her, even after he realized that she belonged to someone else. He desired to have her. He committed adultery with her. After he committed adultery with her, he tried to hide what he had done, this deception, by lying, placed this man in the heat of the battle, caused him to be murdered, to be killed. All right. So what do we have? All stem from, first of all, him desiring to have someone that belongs to someone else. He coveted her. He had committed adultery with her. Not only that, he basically stole another man's wife. Not only that, he had to conceal it. Then he had another man murdered. All right. All this stemmed from the heart. All this stems from the heart. And when you look at all these commandments, all of them are wrapped up with one another. They flow together. They ride together, if you will. Another case is Ahab. Remember the case of Ahab? Naboth had a plot of land next to the palace of Ahab, and Ahab wanted to buy the land. And Naboth said, it's been in my family for generations. I cannot sell it. I would not sell it. And Jezebel says, you know what, you're the king. We're going to make sure that you get this land. All right. And so she lies. All right. She tells a lie, bears false witness against her neighbor by saying that he has talked against God and the king. All right. So he is now killed. He's murdered. All right. His land is taken. All right. Is stolen away. All right. So what do we have? We have that Naboth is killed. Why? Because a man coveted his land. His land is stolen. All right. And all this stemmed from Ahab coveting Naboth's vineyard. He's lied about, all right, that he actually had actually spoken against God and spoken against the king. And because he's spoken against the king, all right, lied about that he's spoken against the king falsely, he is killed. His land is stolen. Right? All of these things are wrapped together. Right? So God is here regulating the heart, a commandment against how we think. Right? So we have to regulate how we think. We have to make sure that we're regulating how we think, because if all these things, we're going to blaspheme God's name, we're going to take another God other than God, we're going to steal from our neighbor, we're going to take our neighbor's wife, we're going to bear false witness against our neighbor. All these things are encapsulated in the way that we think. And if we can control the way we think, we'll control the actions that we commit. Because all of these commandments, the ones that we've looked at, are against actions. This is a commandment against our thoughts. It is a commandment against the way we think. Right? And so he says that God says you should not covet your neighbor's house, covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's male servant, his female servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is his neighbor's. In conclusion, in Romans chapter 13, verse 8, the text says, "Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commandment, you should not commit adultery, you should not murder, you should not steal, you should not covet, and any other commandment are all summed up in this word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law." Wow. He says, love. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to commit adultery with your neighbor's wife. You're not going to take your neighbor's life. You're not going to take your neighbor's property or try to take him. You're not going to covet what is your neighbor's. All right. Why? Because you love your neighbor. You want what's best for your neighbor. All right. And so if we were to make this as Christians, although we realize that we're not under the 10 Commandments, we did see where they were specified again in the New Testament, except for keeping the Sabbath. God wants us to love one another. First of all, as Jesus said, the first thing we need to do is love God. And if we love God, we're going to love those that are made in the image of God. And so God wants us to love one another. And when we love God, and when we love those that are made in the image of God, we're going to make sure that we do good and do right by God, and that we do right by those made in his image. May we ever love one another the way that God has commanded us to, realizing that if we're going to fulfill the law of God, the law of Christ, we have to show love to God, and we got to show love to one another.